Have you ever found yourself agreeing to something and then, like 5 minutes later, you're just thinking, wait, why did I say yes to that? Well, chances are you weren't just being nice. You're probably nudged by one of the powerful kind of hidden principles of persuasion. Today, we're cracking open Robert Cialdini's classic book, Influence, to really unpack two of the most potent psychological levers that shape our decisions every single day.
So let's kick things off with a wild story from Cialdini. There's this jewelry store owner, right? She has some turquoise necklaces that just will not sell. She's about to leave on a trip, so she scribbles a quick note to her staff. Price times 1/2. Simple enough. But her employee misreads it and accidentally doubles the price of everything. And you know what happens? When she gets back, every single piece is gone, sold out. And this isn't some one-off thing. Cialdini also tells us about a guy who actually walked away from a $250 necklace because the price was too low. He wanted something, quote, really nice.
So this just begs the question that's really at the heart of all of Cialdini's work. Why would a higher price tag, which should be a negative, suddenly become the very thing that makes someone pull out their wallet? It kind of suggests our brains aren't the super rational computers we like to think they are. Not even close.
To understand this weird behavior, we've got to look under the hood at how our brains are actually wired. Cialdini has a great name for it, the click-run response, and it's a fundamental part of how we get through the day.
The big idea here is something called judgmental heuristics. It's a fancy term, but really just think of them as mental shortcuts. I mean, we are bombarded with information all day long. We can't possibly analyze every little detail of every decision. So our brains create these simple rules of thumb, like expensive equals good. And most of the time, this shortcut works out okay, but it also leaves us wide open to some pretty big mistakes.
And this really breaks down our two ways of thinking. On one hand, you've got controlled responding. That's the slow, careful, analytical way. But let's be honest, we usually default to the other one, click-run responding. It's fast, it's automatic, and it's triggered by just a single piece of information. The people buying that jewelry, they weren't carefully analyzing the turquoise. No way. They were just reacting to the price tag. Click, high price, run, buy it. Cialdini uses this brilliant animal metaphor to make it stick. A mother turkey's maternal instinct is triggered by just one thing, the cheep sound of her chicks. So researchers did this crazy experiment. They took a stuffed polecat, which is a turkey's natural enemy, and put a little speaker inside that played the cheep sound. And what did she do? She gathered her mortal enemy under her wing to protect it. It's a totally automatic, fixed action pattern. Click, cheep, run, mothering. And we humans, well, we have our own versions of that cheep sound.
And that brings us to the first major weapon of influence, as he calls it, reciprocity. This is probably one of the most deeply wired shortcuts we have.
So how powerful is our need to give back? Check out this experiment. A professor sent Christmas cards to a list of people he'd never met, complete strangers. And what happened? Holiday cards came flooding back to him. These people had no idea who he was, but they got something, and that click-run response just took over. The obligation to reciprocate was completely automatic.
Now, this principle can be used very strategically. Cialdini calls it the rejection then retreat technique. He tells this story about a Boy Scout who asked him to buy some $5 circus tickets. Cialdini said no. Then the scout retreated to a much smaller request, a $1 candy bar. Cialdini ended up buying 2, even though he doesn't even like chocolate. Why? Because the scout made a concession, and that triggered an automatic, powerful pull for Cialdini to make a concession in return.
So you see, the rule that's at play here isn't just about repaying favors, it's about repaying concessions. When somebody backs down from a big request to a smaller one, we feel this powerful, automatic obligation to meet their concession with one of our own, which usually means changing our no to a yes. Okay, let's move on to another incredibly powerful lever, social proof. This one is all about our deep tendency to look at what other people are doing to figure out what we should do.
The principle itself is pretty simple. When we're feeling uncertain, we essentially outsource our decision-making to the crowd. If a whole bunch of people are doing something, we just assume it must be the right thing to do. It's a shortcut that helps us navigate the world without having to think too hard. You see it everywhere. Laugh tracks on old sitcoms, most popular labels on menus, it's all social proof.
And the power of the crowd is scalable. In this famous experiment, researchers had people just stand on a busy New York City sidewalk and stare up at the sky. When it was just one person looking up, yeah, almost no one joined in. But as the group got bigger, the effect became magnetic. With 15 people looking up, 40% of passersby stopped and looked up too. It just goes to show, the more people we see doing something, the more correct we assume it is.
But this reliance on the crowd, it has a really dark side.
Social proof helps explain one of the most disturbing parts of human behavior, the bystander effect. Why is it that sometimes large groups of people will just stand by and fail to help someone who is in obvious distress? It's caused by this chilling phenomenon called pluralistic ignorance. In a confusing, ambiguous emergency, our first instinct is to look to others for cues. But here's the problem. If everyone else is also just calmly looking around instead of acting, we all collectively decide it must not be an emergency. The social proof creates this dangerous feedback loop where nobody does anything.
So how in the world do you break that spell? Well, Cialdini gives very clear, specific advice. Don't just scream for help into the void. You have to remove the uncertainty. Isolate one person from the crowd. Point at them. You, in the blue jacket, I need help. Call 911. That command shatters the group's paralysis and turns a passive bystander into an active helper.
So we've seen how these powerful principles work. But here's the million-dollar question. How do we defend ourselves when they're being used against us?
Now, the goal here is not to become a total cynic who rejects every kind gesture. I mean, these shortcuts exist for a reason. They're usually helpful. The real key is just to get good at recognizing when a genuine social rule is being twisted into a compliance tactic to get you to do something.
So how do you push back against unwanted reciprocation? Cialdini's advice is actually really simple. You just have to remember that the rule applies to favors, not to tricks. Your whole defense is to just redefine what's happening. Here's the tactic. It's like a little mental judo move. Go ahead and accept an initial offer or favor. But if you start to realize it wasn't a genuine gift but was actually a setup for a much bigger request, you perform a mental redefinition. This isn't a gift anymore, it's a sales device. And as soon as you see it that way, poof, that psychological hook, that feeling of obligation, it's just gone. You're free to say no without feeling guilty.
And what about defending against faulty social proof? You just have to check the autopilot every now and then. Remember that social proof can be deliberately faked, think of all those fake online reviews, or it can just be plain wrong, like with the bystander effect. When you feel that pull of the crowd, just take a second. Step back and check the social evidence against the actual objective facts.
Ultimately, what Cialdini's work really gives us is like an owner's manual for the human brain. It gives you the ability to see the invisible strings that guide so much of our behavior. And once you can see them, you're in a much better position to decide for yourself which ones you actually want to follow. So the real question is, now that you can see the levers, who's pulling them in your life?